DJ PK, and we are joined now by Andy Bailey, NBA writer and analyst for Bleacher Report. Andy, welcome back to the show.
Thank you for having me, guys. Appreciate it.
So it's less than a month to the NBA draft. Now, we had the draft lottery, and there was lots of disappointment and all of that. But is the draft order going to hold? Are teams going to trade? Are the Jazz going to be involved? Are the Spurs going to move? Do they need another guard who's 6'6" or smaller? Really? Is Harper a great fit at 6'6"? Next to Castle, who's listed at 6'6", and Fox, who they acquired from Sacramento, who's 6'3". Does that make sense? So the Spurs, they got to make a deal. It's a great small ball lineup, but everybody's trying to get bigger. They're trying to get smaller.
Yeah, I mean, you set it up perfectly. I think the Sixers, they're another one, but the Spurs are primed to make a move, and they've been posturing for basically ever since the lottery that they think all three of those guys can play together. But I'm with you. I think you want to be a little bit bigger than that. I guess theoretically you can play those three together and think that you'd be fine athletically. Because Harper and Castle are pretty long for their position, and for that matter, so is De'Aaron Fox. He's got a decent wingspan too. But I would bet that they're at least canvassing the league right now. I inadvertently mentioned the Sixers because I think they're also a pretty easy candidate to make a move. They're certainly not a team that's gonna, they're on the clock every single year with Joel Embiid, assuming his title window is even open at this point. I mean, they've got to strike now, and the number 3 pick doesn't really help them do that unless it's traded for some kind of veteran. So I think both of those are very much up for grabs. Utah seems like a team that could be in the mix for those picks. I think a lot of that would depend on how big their appetite is to move Lauri Markkanen. He would obviously help either one of those teams a lot, but I'm not sure. I think it's a no-brainer, obviously, if you're moving Markkanen for a chance to get flagged, but that's just not on the table. I'm not sure Harper or Bailey moves the needle enough for me to be super confident in trading Markkanen, honestly. But I'm sure all three of those teams are making lots of calls right now.
How about if you move Markkanen for that second or third pick and you get to keep the 5th pick?
Say that again. I'm not sure how they.
So the Jazz trade Markkanen. They get either Philly or San Antonio, and maybe they include a couple other things. But they also keep their current pick, so meaning they have 2 top 5 picks.
That's definitely a lot more interesting. And as you talked through it the second time, I thought, okay, I see where you're coming from. And I do think that's a possibility. If they walk away from the draft with Harper and, say, Trey Johnson, that's a pretty interesting haul. And, I think this has to be factored into the discussion no matter what you're keeping. You have to wonder how old Markkanen is going to be whenever the Jazz are good again.
Yeah.
And they can, there are ways they can speed up that timeline. I think Indiana is a really good example of a team that just sort of stayed in the mix for years and years and years until they finally cashed in on this current iteration. And I think they're kind of proving that maybe you don't need to tank. But that ship has already sailed for Utah. It's kind of my roundabout way of saying if they wanted to make moves to get competitive now and not necessarily be a title contender, I think you could sell that. And I think Lauri Markkanen would be good in that scenario. But given what they've done over the last 2 years, it's probably not all that difficult to justify one more, really rebuild-focused move. And if it resulted in them having 2 top 5 picks in this draft, obviously that'd be a lot harder to pass up than, if you have to get up to 5.
We know the names that have been thrown out there at the top of the draft, and I'm curious if you scream in the night, like, that is the guy? Why is he so far down on the list? Or is there also someone who just makes you shudder, like, that guy is on the, as Jay Drew once said, on the road to Bustville? Why in the world is that guy's name in the mix this high up? That makes no sense to me. Anybody feel strongly about in either direction?
I'll give you a few. I have a couple guys in the first category. The more I watch and read about Trey Johnson, the more I like him. I mentioned him earlier talking about the Jazz. I just think that mold of kind of the smooth shooting guard who can, create a little bit as well is a really interesting player. I don't think it's a great comp, but one name that comes to mind is Devin Booker, and that's a name that I think has haunted Jazz fans for years because they had a chance to draft him once upon a time. And then the other one in that category, and I think this is just my personal preference, I've always liked guys that are big on feel and big on skill. And I think I tend to weigh that a little bit more heavily than athleticism as opposed to some other analysts, and that's Con Knippel. A guy who you just know he can play basketball, as simplistic as that sounds. He can do a little bit of everything. He's got a very repeatable jump shot, which I always like. His mechanics are great on that. I think he's got solid feel as a playmaker for a guy his size. So both of those guys are interesting to me in that range for the Jazz. And the one that I have just been hesitant on this entire way through, really even during the college season, was Ace Bailey. And I understand the appeal with like the length and jump shot combined with that length. But he gives off vibes of, in maybe the worst ways, Michael Porter Jr., who's a player that I actually think is kind of underrated in the NBA, but his weaknesses are the fact that he doesn't really do a lot besides shoot. And I have a feeling that could be the case with Ace Bailey too. A guy who's, you like those two traits at the top, the size and the shooting. But if he's not contributing in the other categories, it's hard to see how impactful he'll be. I think the further we get into this positionless or largely positionless era of basketball, the more you want guys who can do a lot of different things. It just makes your team more dynamic, less predictable, and I'm not sure Ace Bailey's going to fit that mold.
If the draft holds as expected, the top 3 or 4, if you are the Jazz management, who would you take at 5?
I think I'd probably take Johnson. I have a mock draft pulled up here right now. They've got Jeremiah Fears going there, which I think is kind of interesting too. But and when you have the number 5 pick and you're in Utah's situation where you've already been rebuilding for a couple of years, you're obviously not going to be drafting for need. They're just going to take the best player available. So that's my caveat to what I'm about to say. But I do kind of like Keontae George still and Isaiah Collier. I'm not sure either one of those guys is going to be a star. But I'm just a little bit more – I'm a little higher on the wing upside than the point guard upside. And so I would probably go with Trey Johnson at number 5 if everything, like you said, if everything kind of goes to form through those top 4 picks.
There is a pick at 21. Is there anybody real value out there that you just can't wait to see someone take a flyer on? I mean, the odds aren't great at 21, but people do hit. Is there anyone you've got any conviction in?
I don't know if I'd use the word conviction.
Intrigue. How about intrigue? Serious intrigue.
Yeah. And I just gave a little spiel about how they might not necessarily need a point guard, but I think Walter Clayton is interesting there. I don't think you have to worry too much about age at this point. I know, everybody's so obsessed with we have to have everybody on the same timeline. But in a way, you could kind of get some veteran leadership from a rookie if you took a guy like Walter Clayton there, and I think he could. I think he'd have a chance to play. I just said I like Collier and George, but I don't think either one of those guys is settled in as the point guard of the future. So he's an interesting one to me around that range, depending on how far he falls. And I think he's a candidate to potentially fall. If Igor Denman, hopefully I'm saying that right, from BYU, obviously a lot of Utah area fans are going to know who he is. I think he'd be an interesting guy if he falls that far. Combination of size and playmaking is always super intriguing to me, and he's got that in spades. So that one's a little bit more draft dependent because I don't think he's going to fall to 21, but I don't think it's out of the question either.
So you hail from the other side of our mountain range and know the Nuggets very well. Obviously, they did not have enough depth to compete at the level that they had been competing. What can they do to get better?
There's such an interesting situation. Whoever they hire to be the general manager is walking into a pretty tough spot because Calvin Booth has really already played every card that Denver had. Their draft assets are almost entirely spent. I think the two contracts that people probably anticipate being available, which is Jamal Murray and Michael Porter Jr., I don't think either one of those guys has a ton of trade value right now, and it has to do with durability a lot with both of them, and just the size of their contracts too. I think is going to be daunting for teams. They are the kind of players that if you trade them to get better, you probably have to attach picks, and Denver has already spent all of its picks. The move that blew my mind at the time, and I just keep coming back to, is I think it was just last summer. They salary dumped Reggie Jackson to the Hornets, and they attached 3 second-round picks to him to get it done. Second-round picks don't have a ton of value, but if you were paying attention at the last trade deadline, there were a lot of useful players who were moved for second-round picks. And so they've just spent so much of their capital. I think it's going to have to be a fringe type of a move, and I think you could probably sell that. Their top five is still really good when they're healthy, as rare as that is. But if they could put together, like Zeke Naji and maybe a little bit more salary, and go get a backup five like Kelly Olynyk, that's an idea that's intrigued me for a while. But the kind of realistic trades you're thinking about for the Nuggets aren't going to blow anybody's socks off. Like they're probably not going to be able to swing a massive move this summer just because they've already spent everything they have.
They need to find a Joe Ingles coming over from Europe. They need to find someone in the G League. They need to find their undrafted Alex Caruso.
And, stuff like that. You just named a bunch of examples, and a guy like Joe Ingles would be perfect for them, a playmaker with size. Those guys are obviously hard to get. And I think Denver's coaching staff, or at least the previous one, didn't have a great track record of developing unknown assets. But it's moves like those that really can make the difference for an entire NBA season, really. They kind of had one a couple of years ago. A lot of analysts famously thought the Kentavious Caldwell-Pope move that they made was kind of an effort to duck the luxury tax, but that was a fringe move that turned out to swing the title race. So, it's going to have to be something under the radar. And if it's as far under the radar as, somebody coming from an overseas league or an undrafted free agent, those, if you hit a home run on one of those, you are in great shape.
We were debating earlier, not the best player on the market. Okay, Giannis, right? But who's the best value in a big trade, right? Durant could be moved. Markkanen could be moved. Giannis could be moved. You can go down a list of people. But, to get Giannis, you might have to give up so much you don't have enough left to have the championship team you crave by bringing Giannis on board. So is there a player out there you think really outstrips their value on the trade market and somebody can make a really good deal? And is it Markkanen? Just to lead the witness. Just to lead the witness.
I was going to say, it's so funny you ended the question that way because even as you mentioned his name going through the question, I thought maybe it's Markkanen. The trick there is I think Danny Ainge will be very aggressive or stingy in those trade negotiations, and he may try to extract a ton of value to move him. So that throws off that whole value balance we were just talking about potentially. But when he was healthy, those first 2 years in Utah, he was one of the most interesting, unique offensive weapons in the league. so little wasted dribbles in motion with him. It was just all finishing, all threes, all dunks, all aggressive. He would just be an incredible finisher next to any playmaker in the league. It's fitting that he's nicknamed the finisher, obviously. I mean, he's phenomenal at that. So he's one that stands out. An interesting one to me, and it comes with a mountain of risk, is Zion Williamson. And it depends on, again, how much does New Orleans want to extract to give him up? And if you trade for him, obviously you're going to be biting your fingernails the entire time you have him on the team, because who knows how much he's going to play, who knows when he's going to get hurt. But when he is healthy, on those rare occasions, he's another guy that's just a phenomenal offensive weapon and an incredible finisher like Markin as well. Not the shooter, obviously, but an incredible interior finisher, and I think a very underrated playmaker. So he's an interesting one. I don't know if he fits the value part of the question as much, but he's certainly somebody that I think we're going to hear about this summer.
Andy, we appreciate it. It is always good to talk to you, and maybe we'll check in with you again right before the draft as things change and things shift leading up to it. Thanks for joining us this morning.
Appreciate it, fellas. Have a good one.
Andy Bailey, NBA writer and analyst for Bleacher Report, joining us right here on The Zone. When we come back, everything you missed during today's show, that's next. Stay with us.